In the age of discovery, several explorers circumnavigated or sailed around the globe. Today, on Exploring North Carolina, we're going to take you around the body of water that was for many decades the cradle of agriculture, commerce, government, and fisheries. Join us for a new voyage of discovery, circumnavigating the Albemarle Sound. Exploring North Carolina has long believed that the future of tourism involves travel by water behind our Outer Banks. Recently, we were asked to join an expedition beginning in Elizabeth City, and then on to Edenton, and then to Plymouth, and then on to Columbia, North Carolina, where we would examine the history and cultural resources of the region. We want you to join us today as we travel in a 21st century voyage of discovery. All maritime explorations require a crew and a ship. On this voyage, Exploring North Carolina was privileged to join some of the most talented historians in the Tar Heel State on a beautiful weekend in May. Our expedition included LaRae Umflett of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, Bland Simpson, Kenan professor and author from Chapel Hill, and maritime historian and writer David Soselski. On our ship, the Belle of Washington, were 50 passengers from across the state and beyond who wanted to know more about the rich maritime history of the Albermarle Sound. We asked LaRae Umflett how this voyage came about and how it was put together.
So the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources seeks to promote, preserve, interpret, share the natural and cultural heritage of our state. And along the coastal waterways, these are the areas where our first inhabitants lived, our first towns grew up, and where our earliest histories took place. So seeing history and culture and the natural environment from the waterways is how our first residents experienced the glory of what would become North Carolina. And opportunities like this boat trip through the Albermarle Sound help us teach that history and the experiences of our earliest residents in a different way that can hopefully be the beginnings of a new eco-heritage tourism initiative in the coastal regions. Some of these areas are some of the most economically depressed in the state, and by bringing tourist dollars into these communities and helping them develop a new alternative to an income for the community will be a benefit to everyone who lives there.
We asked LaRae how she found the boat and about the goals of the voyage.
So we wanted to find a way to highlight the coastal heritage and culture from the waterways. And I found a wonderful boat and crew in the Belle of Washington and John Butler. And they were so easy to work with, and we were so grateful to have a wonderful 80-foot boat that could accommodate so many passengers and take us on these great waterways. And from there, once we knew the boat and where she could go and how big she was and those sorts of things, we built the travel itinerary around where the docks were, where the boat could go, where they needed to get gas, all of those things that we had to address. We felt that this trip was important enough as an example to show the viability of this concept.
My longtime friend Bland Simpson has written for many years about eastern North Carolina as a watery world.
We're a maritime state. A lot of times people don't think of us that way, but I think everybody in the Sound Country and even the inner and outer coastal plains realize that. We got so many rivers, large and small, and we have these big, beautiful sounds and smaller sounds connecting to them. We're a maritime state. The way we toured the Albemarle Sound, we were able to look at these lovely river ports, Elizabeth City, Hertford, Edenton, Plymouth, Columbia, the way a traveler back in the late 1800s or early 1900s would have been able to, going by a steamboat or by excursion boat, also usually by steam, from Elizabeth City down the Pasquotank and on over to Old Nag's Head or Manteo. So it is a way of time travel, to drop back in time and see the land and the little settlements the way our ancestors did.
Bland grew up in Elizabeth City and knows the small towns of his childhood on the Albemarle Sound.
Well, I grew up loving these places. Elizabeth City, beautiful brick buildings all downtown and on East Main Street coming down to the water, and the natural setting there is just gorgeous. So is Hertford's, home of Catfish Hunter, the great baseball pitcher. And Edenton, colonial town with some of the oldest, loveliest buildings anywhere in the state. It's a pure pleasure to stand at the top of the green at the old 1767 courthouse and look down the green there and all those beautiful sycamore trees right down to the Sound. Plymouth is another gorgeous town right there on the Roanoke, and a very important town in many ways. It was the choke point of the Roanoke during the Civil War. Some large battles fought there. Civil War history is very important for us to recognize and know. Columbia, home of my grandmother, a tiny little mercantile town on the Scuppernong River. These are small towns. Each of them has its own character, its own look, and they are, I think, key to an area of the state's great tourist industry and economy. It's our second largest business, and anyone who takes a little moment to get off that so-called beaten track and go into the towns we've been talking about is really going to enjoy it.
Our point of departure was Elizabeth City. As we left this lovely coastal town and headed down the Pasquotank River, we could see the mighty Albemarle Sound opening wide ahead of us. It was here that we asked coastal historian David Soselski to tell us about the early maritime history of the Albemarle Sound after European settlement.
The Albemarle Sound was really the cradle of maritime life in early North Carolina. Ships would come from England and France. There was constant traffic back and forth between the Albemarle and New England, the Chesapeake. There was also a steady traffic between the Albemarle ports like Edenton, Plymouth, Columbia, and the Caribbean, the West Indies, and Bahama and the Bermudas. In that era, particularly in the 18th century, the Albemarle was really the cultural and political center of North Carolina, and the trade in that area, everything relied on those ships and on water traffic. You look at the old maps of North Carolina in that period for the Albemarle, every plantation, every town is on a body of water. It was the way you carried goods to market. It was the way you went to visit your neighbor. It was the way that you got the news. It was a water world. In addition, some of the largest fisheries in the American South were located there. So it was also kind of a center of economic opportunity.
It is often forgotten that the early commerce of this region depended in large part on enslaved African Americans in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
African Americans played a central role in all of those maritime activities. They crewed the vessels that brought produce down to the river ports. They composed large parts of the crew on those sailing vessels that traveled to England and the Caribbean. Often they were the majority of sailors on those vessels. They ferried people across rivers. They brought shingles and staves out of the Great Dismal Swamp on these broad flatboats. They dug the canals, which was also an activity that involved a lot of boats, that made agriculture possible in many of those places. In every facet of maritime life, African Americans were at least a big part, and in many cases they composed the majority of the maritime laborers. The McKnight Shipyard in Currituck County in the 18th century was the state's largest shipyard. Every single builder at the shipyard, except for the superintendent, was an African American. They were the caulkers, they bent the wood, they hewed the wood, they rigged the sails. Everything was in the hands of enslaved African Americans.
I asked David Soselski to tell us about the number and occupations of African Americans in the Albemarle region around the time of the American Revolution.
So roughly 100,000 enslaved people made up the central part of the workforce on Albermarle Sound at the time of the American Revolution. They were, they did jobs of the kind we usually associate with American slavery. They picked the crops, they tended the tobacco, they were house servants, but they were also skilled brick masons and shipbuilders and pilots of vessels that traded back and forth between the Albemarle and Ocracoke and Portsmouth Islands. They were the, you could not imagine the building of North Carolina as a colony without those people.
After leaving Elizabeth City, we headed west about 30 miles along the north shore of the Albemarle Sound and turned up the Perquimans River towards Hertford. Here, the expedition visited the Newbold White House, a brick home built in 1730 by Abraham Saunders, an early Quaker settler. This fantastic dwelling is thought to be one of the first brick houses built in North Carolina. After leaving the Newbold White House, we motored down the Perquimans River to the Albemarle Sound. It was here that David Soselski explained the history of one of the most significant fisheries in North America, located on the Albemarle Sound.
One of the greatest spectacles, the most extraordinary sights, the hardest work, the biggest enterprises that you would have ever seen in the Albemarle Sound and the rivers that flow into it was the great herring and shad fisheries that were there, really beginning around the 1740s and lasting throughout the slavery period and beyond. But before the Civil War, you would have seen literally thousands of African Americans, most of them enslaved, but also many free African Americans, moving down from 7, 8, 9 different counties down to the shore, living in camps of 40, 50, 60 people, and wielding a kind of net that we call a seine, these broad sweep nets that would be, it took two boats to carry out into the Sound. The seine was large enough to block the width of some rivers. And they would catch so many fish, sometimes 100,000 fish. I've seen one account of 500,000 fish in a single haul. Mostly women and children, sometimes old men would clean, cut, and salt the fish. Others would make the barrels that the fish were going to be stored. They would salt them, store them in barrels, and send them literally all over the United States and to the West Indies. every phase of that fishery depended on African American labor. After the Civil War, of course, slavery had ended. They continued to be predominantly African American workers. The boats made a transition from being oar-driven to steam-powered. Again, most often with African American captains and crews.
Still heading west on the Albemarle, we arrived in Edenton. Although the town was not incorporated until 1752, the area was explored and settled by Virginians in the 1650s. You may know Edenton as the second capital of North Carolina from 1722 to 1743. Today, this town is still beautiful, and the old courthouse, built in 1767, is its centerpiece. Once the major port in the Albemarle region, it lost this designation to Elizabeth City after the completion of the Dismal Swamp Canal in the first decade of the 19th century.
Edenton was very jealous when that canal idea started to get political support and was going to go into effect. They were very afraid. Edenton was the big town on the Albemarle before Elizabeth City got the good of that canal.
After departing Edenton, we headed west toward the Roanoke River at the west end of the Albermarle Sound. We could not forget the first English settlement on the Albemarle at Roanoke Island, the Lost Colony. As you will remember, 130 English colonists were deposited on Roanoke Island in 1587. By 1590, they had disappeared. We couldn't help but wonder whether the colonists had navigated the same waters of the Albemarle in search of a new home to the west. As our expedition left the tranquility of the Sound, we were attacked, actually greeted, by the replica of the Confederate gunboat Albemarle as we entered Plymouth near the mouth of the Roanoke River. As Bland Simpson told us, Plymouth was the site of major Civil War battles. It is a town rich in history, but on exploring North Carolina, we have long regarded Plymouth as a four-season destination. The lands around Plymouth are home to one of the largest concentrations of black bear in North America. From December through mid-February, the National Wildlife Refuges south of Plymouth are also home to some of the most beautiful waterfowl displays in Eastern America. After leaving Plymouth on the Belle of Washington, our expedition sailed down the south side of the Albemarle Sound toward Columbia at the mouth of the Scuppernong River. Columbia, the county seat of Terrell County, is a lovely town of less than 1,000 people. Like all places we visited on this voyage of discovery on the Albemarle, Columbia is ready to welcome visitors. Further down the Scuppernong and up a famous canal dug in the late 1780s, we ended our journey at one of North Carolina's most compelling historic attractions, Somerset Plantation, where you will see what life on Phelps Lake was like at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. As we departed Somerset Plantation for our homes across North Carolina and beyond, we wanted to know whether this idea of historical and ecotourism has a future in eastern North Carolina. Lorraine Umflett and Bland Simpson offered us their thoughts.
Tourism is a major economic force in eastern North Carolina, and these communities along these waterways can benefit in an additional way through the development of boat traffic along their dock sides and marinas and waterfronts. As we have demonstrated with this trip through the Albemarle Sound, that folks from across the state and even neighboring states consider this a worthwhile endeavor, a wonderful experience where they get to learn and see something that is really not something that you can just go out and do on your own. Throughout my interactions with the visitors who took our boat cruise, to a person, they all had a wonderful time, and they couldn't name especially one thing over another that was the best for them, because they had such a wonderful time learning about the history, the culture, seeing bald eagles and these swamps and these areas that you really don't see from the interstate.
Well, I never had a conversation with our late and great president, William Friday of the university, that in the last 30 years that didn't end with his saying, and we can get, if we just keep trying, we can get a little more of that tourism business that's serving us so well now. I think this waterborne kind of business, like the trip we just did, there are many possible routes to take boats. And we just went around the north and south shore of the Albemarle. One might go down the Pamlico River from Little Washington, come back around up the Neuse to Newbern. In so doing, we could bring interest and income in from the barrier islands, from the Outer Banks and so on, into the interior ways to perfectly wonderful and very charming, very deeply interesting places. The interior, the Sound Country, is enormous. And it can take a lot of visitors, and I hope we get them, because we have a lot to show, a lot to celebrate.
David Soselski looks at the water and sees something else on the Albemarle Sound: freedom.
The life of African American maritime laborers in many ways breaks the mold on how we usually think of slavery. And above all, it was this as Frederick Douglass pointed out, the sea was this symbol of freedom, this possibility that you could aspire to something beyond the horizon.
We have concluded this 21st century voyage of discovery in Columbia, North Carolina. And we're at a fitting location, the intersection of Main Street and Water Street. On exploring North Carolina, we believe that the future of tourism in North Carolina will involve good roads, but also much more travel by water. And we learned this while exploring North Carolina.